Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 6th of April of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about massive missile and drone strike that took place during the previous night between the 5th and the 6th of April of 2025. Today the pro-Ukrainian sources summarized the information we got during the previous night, and they published this picture. In this picture we can see the roads of attacks that the Russians used during the previous night. Furthermore, the Russians, according to this map, according to this picture, used a significant number of different types of weapon. The Russians were using cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, air ballistic missiles, and a significant number of drones. And the most important, the Russians attacked the territory of Ukraine from the Black Sea. This is very important detail about the previous attack. And Zelensky, of course, commented the situation. Zelensky stated that today's Russian strike involved missiles launched from the Black Sea. This is one of the reasons why Russia is not agreeing to an unconditional ceasefire. They want to retain the ability to strike our cities and ports from the sea, he said in a daytime address. Zelensky also said that we can manufacture air defense systems and missiles for them in Ukraine, but we need localization of production and licenses from partners. According to information we have, the United States of America rejected to provide Ukrainians licenses for production of the Patriot systems and missiles to them. Furthermore, we have once again the picture that shows us the let's say the work of Ukraine air defense, and as you can see, the Ukrainians during the previous night managed to bring down just 13 out of 23 missiles and 40 out of 109 drones. So we see that most likely this is one of the poorest results of Ukraine air defense. Let's discuss several more important statements from Ukraine. And I would like to point your attention to this statement that was made by the head of the main intelligence directorate. He stated today that people don't need to know the whole truth, otherwise they will have their own opinion. That was stated once again by the head of the main intelligence directorate, by Budanov. So this is the person I'm talking about. This is Kirill Budanov. He's responsible for many special operations carried out by the Ukrainians since the beginning of the special military operation. We're talking about Crimean Bridge, we're talking about gas pipelines, we're talking about, let's say, the Belgorod direction and Kursk region. So he was responsible for all those operations, and he stated today that Ukrainians shouldn't know everything because this is going to be not very good. Society must be ready to learn the truth, probably over time. During a war, I think it is unnecessary to know the whole truth. Otherwise, people may have different opinions. I'm not talking about distorting reality or anything like that. No, it's just that not everyone's consequences is ready to accept the harsh truth. It is not worth, as they say, testing people with this. Another important statement by the candidate for the president of Ukraine, most likely the president elections are going to take place this year. She stated that there is an international plan to end the war in Ukraine by the end of the May. So this was stated by Tymoshenko. So everything is going, that's very likely something will happen in May if something will not ruin the negotiation process. Now let's go to the ground and let's discuss the situation along the line of combat contact. And first we're going to talk about the Sumy direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. During the previous 24 hours we received lots of very interesting updates, and probably the most important is that the Russians reported that as a result of clashes, the group of forces north managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Basovka. I'll remind you that the village of Basovka is the village that is located on the territory of Sumy region. So this is already not the territory of the Russian Federation, this is already the territory of Ukraine, and we see that the Russians began this process to create the security zone, and the Russians are getting closer and closer to the settlement by the name of Yunakivka, which is probably the main task of the Russians for this stage of offensive operation. Furthermore, the Russians established complete artillery control and FPV drone control over the settlement and over the main roads around. In this video we can see, for example, a very powerful stronghold of the armored forces of Ukraine in the vicinity of the settlement of Yunakivka. Basically, this is the next target and the next task of the armored force of the Russian Federation. The Russians are probably in 2-3 kilometers from this area, and we believe that the Russians are planning to begin offensive operation in this direction in the very near future. For example, in this video we can see how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian positions and were trying to destroy this company's stronghold. So this is exactly the territory that the Russians were attacking. The distance between the edge positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation and this stronghold is already less than 5 kilometers. When talking about the village of Basovka, the distance in this case is less than around 3 kilometers. So the Russians are very close to this area. But before attacking in this direction, first the Russians need to find a solution how to force the Ukrainians to fall back from the settlement of Oleshnya. And as for the end of the 6th of April of 2025, the Russian reported that fighting is taking place on the outskirts of the settlement. So probably during the next several days, the Russians will be able to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this area, and the Russians, at least in this particular direction, will be able to restore control over the border and over the territory of the Russian Federation, and then the Russians will be able to answer the territory of Ukraine. The most interesting updates from this area are coming from the village of Gueva. As you can see, we have lots of icons from this area because there are very heavy clashes and the Russians are advancing. Today we have lots of geolocations that allow us to adjust the map, and this is the first, for example, geolocation. In this video, we can see how the Russians raised their flag on the territory, on the roof of the church that is located in the central part of the settlement of Gueva. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. Later, the pro-Ukrainian sources published this video, and here we can see how the units and soldiers of 82nd Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine were repelling the Russian attacks, and how the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the buildings and the positions that were taken by the Russians as a result of offensive operation. Here we can see how the Russians entered the building in the northern part, and then the Ukrainians began bombing and attacking this territory with mortar and with artillery systems. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map as well. Furthermore, several sources reported that the Russians established complete control over the northern part. So, summarizing everything, we see that currently the Russians established control over around 40% of the village of Gueva, and the Russians continue offensive operation. We don't sure that the Russians are able to establish complete control over the settlement within the next hours, but obviously 2-3 days, and the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back further in the southwestern direction towards the settlement by the name of Garnal. And we believe that the village of Garnal is going to be the last village the Russians are planning to start fighting with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to completely fall back from the Kursk region. As for the Belgorod direction, there are still very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians continue digging in deeper. The Russians continue redeploying of their forces, but during the previous 24 hours, as you can see, without significant changes on the ground. The Russians, mainly during the previous 24 hours, were working on Ukrainian rear positions. They were bombing and attacking the warehouses, ammo depots. The Russians were trying to destroy Ukrainian logistics. The Russians carried out successful counter-artillery duels. So it was something like this, without significant changes on the ground. Furthermore, I would like to tell you that currently the weather in Ukraine is very bad. Not just in Ukraine, in this region the weather is very bad, and obviously the bad weather, let's say, changed the plans of the Russians and the Ukrainians. Currently everybody is waiting when the weather is going to get better, and according to information we have, the entire whole week is going to be not very good for offensive operations, both for the Russians and for the Ukrainians. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the northern Kupiansk direction. First, let's talk once again about the settlement of Kamenka. Today, according to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to take the eastern part of the settlement under complete control. And the most important, that this information was confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources as well. So let's take a look at how the situation was developing. Once again, this is the situation by the end of the 2nd of April. Probably this is exactly the moment when the Russians began their offensive. This is the situation by the end of the 4th of April. The Russians secured the southern part, the Russians crossed the river Voskol and forced the Ukrainians to fall back. This is the situation by the end of the 5th of April, and this is the situation by the end of the 6th of April. And the most important thing when talking about all these videos, we see that the Russians were taking one building after another, and the only thing that Ukrainians could do is to attack the Russian positions with FPV drone. We believe and we see, according to geolocations and according to these updates, that Ukrainians almost have no troops in this direction. They tried to stop, or at least to slow down, the Russians just with the use of artillery and FPV drones, which means that if the Ukrainians are not planning to redeploy additional reinforcements in this direction, we are talking about infantry and vehicles, most likely the Russians will be able to establish complete control over these territories and to force the Ukrainians to fall back, probably towards the settlement of Grigorovka. But Grigorovka is very close, is much closer to the city of Volchansk than never before. So we see that the Russians are advancing, and we see that soon the battle for Volchansk most likely will intensify as well. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation around the settlement of Kupiansk. We have a lot of interesting updates. During the previous 24 hours, as you can see, we received lots of videos, lots of geolocations, how the Russians were attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine on the territory of the settlement of Kondrashovka and around with a significant number of drones. We see that the Russians are very active in this direction, that the Russians are increasing their pressure, and the Russians are planning to establish complete control over this territory during the next several days. During the previous 2 or 3 days, we received lots of updates that the Russians already established complete control over these territories, but the reports and updates we continue receiving, tell us completely different thing. They confirm that there are still very heavy clashes and that the Russians are advancing and the Ukrainians suffer losses. For example, in this video we can see how the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian vehicles and that the Russians destroyed them as a result of FPV drones, and as you can see, the Ukrainians most likely were trying to evacuate damaged or at least vehicles, but instead of evacuation the Ukrainians lost 2 more vehicles in this area. So once again, there are very heavy clashes for the settlement of Kondrashovka still, and we expect that due to this pressure, we believe that in the very near future the Russians will establish complete control over this territory, and this can lead to beginning of the battle for the city of Kupiansk itself. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Leman and Baroa direction. As you can see here, we have also lots of icons, and these icons tell us that the Russians increase their pressure. They're increasing their pressure to attack the settlements and the territories around the village of Novo, Lipova, Ridka, Dupin, Katerinovka. Once again, according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions, and the most important, the Russians answered the village of Novo from the southeast. This territory is already under complete Russian control, and as we discussed, the Russians currently are trying to establish complete control over the southern part, including these farms, and the Russians have already begun clearing operation. In this video we can see how the units of the 20th Army of the Armored Forces of the Russian Federation were bombing and attacking the positions of the Armored Forces of Ukraine to the south of their, let's say, strong foothold in this in the village of Nova. So which means that first of all the Russians will try to take under control over these territories. This is going to be the first goal of the Russians, and when the Russians are able to do this from these positions, the Russians will try to attack in the northwest, and of course they will try to attack in the northern direction. We expect that during the next week the settlement of Nova will be captured by the Russians. The only chance for Ukrainians is to bring additional forces here, but the only brigade they have in this direction that can show more or less resistance is the 3rd Brigade of Azov, but according to their social networks they suffered huge losses during the battle for Nadia, and they continue suffering losses, and they began active recruit campaign, which most likely also confirms the significant losses that this brigade suffered during the previous weeks. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Leman direction, where the Russians also continue their offensive operation. I'll remind you that just yesterday the Russians, as a result of offensive, managed to enter the northern part of the village of Tarskoye. As for the end of the 6th of April, still nobody has confirmed this information. Maybe the Russians are already in the northern part, but we don't have enough of proofs to make some changes on the ground. Furthermore, the Russians currently are trying to attack the village of Tarskoye from the east. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians carried out several counter-offensive operations, and most of them failed. For example, in this video we can see how the Russians were attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine, but the Russians were ambushed by Ukrainian FPV drones, and after several attempts to attack the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine, the Russians were forced to fall back towards their reliable, let's say, towards their defense belt. At the same time, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine in the eastern part of the village of Tarskoye, trying to destroy and to establish complete control over Ukrainian logistics. So we see that there are very heavy clashes right now. The Russians are increasing their pressure, and we expect that despite the fierce resistance from the Ukrainian side, sooner or later the Russians will be able to improve their positions and to take the village of Tarskoye completely. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation around the settlement of Konstantinovka. There are very heavy clashes, and probably the most interesting updates are coming from the city of Chasiv Yar. Just yesterday we discussed that the Russians managed to secure their western flank, northwestern flank. The Russians managed to dig in deeper. The Ukrainians made several counterattacks in this direction, but most of them were repelled by the Russians. And when the Russians realized that Ukrainians have almost no chances to restore control over these territories, the Russians continued their offensive operation in the direction of the central part of the city. And during the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions, and we have geolocations that confirm this. For example, in this video, we can see how the Ukrainians were after withdrawing the Russians in this area, and how the Ukrainians were attacking the edge positions of the armored forces of the Russian Federation. One of those strikes was geolocated exactly in this point. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. When talking about other pro-Russian resources, they reported that this entire territory was captured and secured by the Russians, and according to different pro-Russian resources, the Ukrainians controlled just several buildings in the central part. Furthermore, according to this configuration of the line of combat contact, we understand that Ukrainians most likely were caught in cauldron, and the only way how they can get the supply and support is by using drones. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the city of Toretsk, where the Russians also continue their offensive operation. And today, pro-Ukrainian sources confirmed that the Russians managed to secure almost 70% or even 80% of the Zabalka micro-district. According to Deep State update, the Ukrainians, let's say, abandoned their positions completely. Probably there are just rearguard forces whose main purpose is to slow down the Russians and to allow other groups of forces for evacuation and rotation. So the battle for Toretsk is coming to an end, and telling the truth, soon we're going to see like a year of battle for the entire Toretsk agglomeration. We are talking about not just about this city, but also about the settlements like Sumy, Pavlovka, Pivnichne. I'll remind you that first the Russians took under control these territories, and these territories were taken by the Russians very fast. For example, the city of Toretsk, the Russians were fighting for a very long period of time, one of the longest battle, one of the longest assault operation since the beginning of the special military operation. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. And the most important is that the Russians managed to repel every single offensive operation that was carried out by the Ukrainians since the beginning, probably of March. The Russians managed to restore control almost over the entire salient, and the Russians now regrouping or finishing regrouping before resuming their attempts to attack the Ukrainians and to force them to fall back from the next defense line. And we are talking about the settlements like Novoalexandrovka, the settlement like Udachne, and the settlement of Kotlina. So these are the next targets of the Russians, and most likely during the next week we're going to start receiving first updates from this area. The most important update is coming from Salona. The Russians managed to restore control over this territory, and we have geolocation that confirm this. In this video, we can see a Ukrainian drone that was bombing the Russian units there. Based on this video, most of the mappers have adjusted their maps. Furthermore, I reminded that several days ago, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation confirmed complete control over the village of Uspenovka. In the vicinity of Kotlina, the Russians continued destroying abandoned Ukrainian vehicles that Ukrainians lost during their attempts to counterattack. In this video, we can see the Ukraine Max Pro that was attacked by the Russian drone and destroyed completely to the southeast of the settlement of Kotlina. So the Ukrainians, as we can see, suffered huge losses during their attempts to counterattack. They haven't managed to achieve any results, and now they are forced to fall back further towards more reliable positions. Now let's discuss the situation in the Novopavlovka direction. We have small changes on the ground. Today the Ukrainian sources published this video, and in this video published by the 35th Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, we can see how the Russians were attacking the positions of Ukrainian forces in the fields between the settlements. And this episode took place exactly in this area, and based on this video we have adjusted the map. So now we see that the Russians are trying to advance in the fields between the settlement of Andreevka and the settlements that located on the Novopavlovka direction. As you can see, there is a huge gap, no settlements, just 3 lines and fields, and now the Russians began battle for this territory. Based on this video, we came to conclusion that now the Russians are trying to maintain the lines and to establish complete control over everything in this pocket between the village of Bogdanovka and the village of Andreevka. So this is the primary target for the Russians, which will allow them, first of all, to maintain the lines, to release forces, and to use them on someone else's direction. The battle for Bogatyr is continuing. Today we got report that the Russians managed to break through the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine to the west of the village of Rozliv, and that the Russians managed to establish control over the strategic elevation. And currently the village of Bogatyr is located right in front of the Russians, and the Russians can control the entire village with drones and artillery. So we expect that due to this significant success of the armored forces of the Russian Federation, the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back in the very near future. And the military experts are saying that the Ukrainians will not be able to control and to hold their lines in this village for a very long period of time. The Russians have already established complete FPV drone control over the territories behind the village of Alexeevka and Bogatyr. In this video we can see how the Russians destroyed another abandoned vehicle by the armored force of Ukraine. In this video, for example, we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the most northwestern part of the village. The Russians destroyed the Ukrainian FPV drone positions, and for example in this video we can see another vehicle destroyed by the Russians during the rotation or evacuation process that Ukrainians were trying to carry out during the night period of time. In this video we can see how the Ukrainians were trying to evacuate but got problem in the minefield and were destroyed. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Zaporizhzhia direction where the Russians continue their offensive operation. The sources reported that Ukrainians continue their counterattacks. There is still a very difficult situation in the vicinity of the villages of Mali Sherbaki and Sherbaki. The initiative is completely in the Russian hands. The Ukrainians, after another wave of counterattack, were defeated and were forced to fall back. And the main reason why the Ukrainians suffer losses and they can't get any success is that the Russians redeployed one of the most experienced FPV drone squad, Bobry. And we start receiving lots of videos from them. And during the previous several days we got at least 4 or 5 videos with a significant number of episodes, and during these episodes we can see that the Russians during the previous weeks managed to destroy tens of Ukrainian vehicles that Ukrainians were trying to use with the purpose to counterattack the Russians and to restore control over the lost positions. So this is another symmetry of the Western weapon, Western equipment that was created recently by the Russians. We see lots of drones, and if we increase the numbers of this since the beginning of April, we're gonna see lots of icons, lots of videos exactly from this area, how the Russians were destroying and attacking Ukrainian vehicles and so on. So the situation for the Ukrainians is very difficult. We believe that Ukrainians are about to be exhausted, to become exhausted without any possibilities for further counterattacks. And when it happens, we expect that the Russians will continue offensive further in the northern direction, and then it's going to be very difficult to understand, interesting to understand whether the Ukrainians are able to repel upcoming and possible Russian offensives. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.